It is Yuri. Look at this beautiful man. How you doing, Yuri? You doing well?
Hello, Daniel.
Oh my goodness. How's life treating you, Yuri?
Pretty good, man. Pretty good.
I am thrilled. I am thrilled. I hope you're
How
good.
about you? Congratulations on the baby.
Well, thank you. Paul as well. Javier, good to see you. And Samuel, it's a treat. So we are good. We've actually had some crazy ice weather, and yesterday a pine tree exploded on the electrical wire, caught on fire. Fire department came. So we've been out of power randomly for 4 days. So if you've never seen a pine tree explode, it's quite a sight.
Congratulations, mate. Pretty good
Oh,
news.
well, thank you, Samuel. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the day when Paul can nuzzle your cheek, just kind of lie there and just kind of nuzzle. It's going to be really beautiful. The same with you, Yuri, as well. Well, I'm curious if anyone has any topics at all. I would be very interested. I've been reading Dwayne Russell's psychoanalytical sociology. I've also been reading stuff on the Nordic education system, which has been very interesting. The Bildung movement, which people like Leanne Anderson talks about, Thomas Borkman talks about. And really what's interesting with the Nordic secret, y'all all know I talk a lot about Dietrich McCloskey and the Great Enrichment, which happens in the Netherlands, right? Like Holland and all of that. But, between 1815 and 1950 in, Sweden, Denmark, the Nordic nations. And I hate to say this, but until I was like 21, I was always confusing Nordic and Netherlands, and I was such a white Virginian. And I'm like, wait, they're different. Oh, but anyway, so it's funny because what you almost see happening is the great enrichment that occurs with McCloskey, where there's a change in rhetoric and the change of ideas. And what's so critical for McCloskey is that the great enrichment is a result of changes in ideas in the material conditions second, right? Well, I'm very interested in what happens in the Nordic nations because you see some of the poorest nations in Europe, between the 1850s and 1950s, they go from being extremely poor to some of the wealthiest, just almost out of nowhere. And it's very, very odd. And what Leah Anderson, and I'll give it to Michael here, and Thomas Jochen, good to see you, they really stress this new educational initiative that is, they associate it with the Bildung, which is kind of based on German idealism. But there's real emphasis on inner capacity, which sounds kind of wishy-washy, but then when you read about it, it kind of overlaps with some psychoanalytical thinking. And basically, the idea is that a lot of the Nordic government was concerned with the idea that, wow, if complexity of civilization is not going to lead to authoritarianism, then there's going to have to be some building of inner capacity. So there was this real acknowledgement of basically, you could almost say, conservative critiques of destroying nationalism, because that just leads to everyone not having a home and being miserable. But then there's also the idea of, well, can we actually have people have capacities? And actually what's interesting is basing a new citizenship on the Bildung project. And yeah, how did they define inner capacity? Well, for example, a key characteristic would be, and good to see you, Mr. Luber, the ability to handle difference. Like if I'm a Christian in Virginia, handling, say, an atheist in Asia, and we don't have the same first principles, I am not overwhelmed by that difference and then having to alienate them and escape them, right? So inner capacity is absolutely not the kind of lame enlightenment idea that I am more rational and therefore I'm the smartest. Really, it has a lot more to deal with fighting your own demons, honestly, that often come out when you encounter the other and all of that sort of stuff, right? And basically for them, if the education system was not primary in that, then authoritarianism, a new French Revolution would occur, right? And so they instigated this educational program, which I would certainly associate with what Dietrich McCloskey is talking about. And you have this great enrichment that occurs. Now, please note, this only happened, as Lena Anderson talks about, in 10% of the people. This is not a mass effort. And, just like we talk about with, say, these online spaces, there's a funding issue. You had to find some patron that liked it or convince the government to fund. So there's always the money issue, because when you're trying to educate people in a qualitative way versus a quantitative way, you always have the problem of people saying, well, what's going to be the outcome, right? So there also had to be a cultural education to make people value it. So that problem was still there that we see today, but it's just been a very interesting case study to me of another example where a change in mode of consciousness is what leads to material conditions versus the material condition. Now, of course, you can't really draw a straight line between those two things. They go together. because there has to be, like we talk about, a medium condition. But it's a very interesting case study on that education. But I've been reading about that, and I'm happy to talk about anything, but I'll give it to Michael. And Michael, thank you for being here, sir.
It's good to be here. Yeah, I haven't read that book, but I have come across Lena Anderson and I've heard her speak a little bit about Bildung. And yeah, it's super fascinating. I was thinking I'm in a class right now in grad school, a human development class, and this week the prompt for our discussion post was around intelligence testing and aptitude testing and like how we felt about, the way intelligence, IQ specifically, is measured. And it was really interesting to like learn more about kind of like the history of IQ testing and kind of what type of intelligence it tests for. And like I mean, I'm sure this is like, common knowledge to most of us, but it's like it's it's really testing for like a very narrow band of intelligence. It's like your ability to solve like logical puzzles fast. And I was watching a couple TED Talks around IQ and there was one that I watched called like your creative intelligence. And kind of the core thesis of this guy's TED Talk is like with a lot of these, IQ tests, they'll have like these you know, uh, like numerical sequence patterning or kind of logical patterning, and you kind of have to like, in a very linear fashion, kind of follow, identify the pattern and then be able to like predict. Um, and his kind of argument was like there's a different type of intelligence, um, and creativity is like a large part of this of like not just finding the next logical pattern, but finding other logical patterns and often patterns that are better than the existing ones. Um, and and that just, made me think about like different types of intelligences. And then, that reminded me of, John Vervaeke talking about like the 9 dot problem and how like, there's like 5% of people can solve that without a hint. And like the reason most people don't solve it is because they don't realize that they can draw outside of the 3 by 3 square. And it's not just that you can do that, it's that you have to do that. Like you can't solve the problem thinking literally inside the box. Um, and yeah, all that to say, just connecting back to, you know, education, how we educate kids. Um, there a couple of my classmates were also talking about like the phenomenon of like being called like a gifted child, and being in like the gifted programs and things. And one classmate of mine in particular said like, uh, she was like put in the gifted program from like a very young age, and um, she kind of internalized this idea about herself that like everything would come innately easy to her, like based on just her, pure intrinsic natural intelligence. And so anything that like she wasn't good at from the very beginning, she would just immediately quit or discard. And, she realized like once she got out of college, she thought she would just get a job very easily. And it was actually really difficult for her to find a job because like she didn't, she hadn't actually like built up really any skills. And I was just reflecting on that and like how important it is to teach kids to tolerate the frustration of being bad at things and like to cultivate the resilience, the perseverance, the patience, and the self-compassion as well, to actually learn and like how rewarding it is also once notice like incremental improvement in things. And I think this all connects back to internal capacity, inner capacity. Because like once you can tolerate, you said once you can tolerate your own demons inside of yourself, um, and realize that things aren't black and white. It's not, oh, I'm either like intrinsically good at this and I will just like, you know, I picked up a violin the first time and it was magic and that was it. Or I'm just really shitty at this and I'll never be good at it. Um, like to tolerate that gray, that extends outward into tolerating the grayness of humanity, the world. Um, seeing beauty in it. So, um, yeah, I think, and I'll pass it back, but I think the way we view intelligence, I don't know how much of this is just like a United States phenomenon. I'd imagine probably a lot of it isn't, but it's probably like most things, just like really heightened in the United States of like how we view intelligence. And I was definitely, um, I definitely internalized that idea of intelligence until, and your intrinsic motivation, something you talk about, is like it's just non-existent if you view intelligence in that way. If you view it as something that isn't flexible, that's isn't fluid, there's a lot of rhetoric of like IQ tests stay constant, throughout the lifespan. And I think that's probably true, but I think that's more indicative of the testing as opposed to like people's ability to actually become um not just intelligent but also wise. Vervaeke also makes a distinction between intelligence and wisdom. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, it's a fascinating topic, and I know Nassim Taleb has been putting out some recent videos on IQ and the problems of it. And there are parts of me that I am very skeptical of IQ testing, but then I wonder if that's my bias because there does seem to be some correlation in success beyond, I think, 110 or something. And if then you also have the Flynn effect, which you could say what represents 100 has gone up in different things and so on and so forth. And then, of course, I guess it's Duckworth's book called Grit that tries to show that actually grit is a way more important characteristic. And what's very interesting, again, I can't help, like in researching the Bildung education, again, a lot of the terms are things like inner capacity or, psychological diversity and stuff like that. But then when you actually read what it is, it seems a lot more like grit training, honestly, the ability to actually think through and tinker with problems. And I just find it interesting because the language that's being used may not necessarily get at precisely things like grit that are being talked about. Or like the ability, like I definitely saw this. I definitely experienced like people who took IQ tests who saw themselves as having high IQ that actually got in the way of their ability to tinker and work with problems long term, right? Because there would actually be a tendency to say, oh, if I can't solve it quickly, it must just be stupid and not worth doing, or get discouraged in themselves. Necessarily. Yeah, there it is. One of my favorite words, Jurij. You got me. And I'll give it to Javier and Samuel. Like I personally, I hate numbers, and that might just be my bias. So like, for example, I try if I'm going to bed to never look at the clock at night. Because if I only sleep 4 hours and know I only slept 4 hours, it's way worse than not knowing how long you slept the next day, right? So I never look at the clock like once I go to bed, like not check it, because then you become kind of paranoid. Oh my gosh, it's already 2 a.m. and I've got to get up at 6 for work and I slept so little. So by not knowing the time, you kind of trick yourself. And it's better. And I sometimes feel the same with things like IQ or personality tests or stuff like that, right? Like if you have a high IQ, it's almost better to have one and not know you have one, precisely so that you cannot fall into the pit traps of self-awareness. But then that also might be fear, right? Fear of falling into the pit traps of self-awareness. So there are all these interesting little dimensions to it. But I do think the question, like, because ultimately, like Warren Buffett once said that if he was born in prehistoric man, he'd be worthless, right? Like if you're born in a prehistoric society and you have a high IQ that's really good at stock picking, well, no one cares, right? So the very way we define intelligence is always socially conditioned by what we find valuable, right? And you see, that's also the issue. Like, who cares if you're good at quantum mechanics in prehistoric man or in a civilization that doesn't have running water, right? Which then also suggests, because I know Sam, like when you look at the history of breeding, or when people say we don't like, but then ask someone who goes to an Ivy League to marry someone with a 100 IQ, no, we don't want to do that. Well, why? Because we actually do select, right? Based on who we're going to hang out with. based on different qualities and different things. But what's interesting is our selection is also tied to the sociological values that people think is going to succeed and what's going to lead to survival and what's going to give you status and all of those different things. And so it's just very, very interesting because also the ways we will rage, oh, wow, you're a gifted person, is also inevitably tied to the historic moment. In an age with computers, a gifted person can say code. In an age of hunting, a gifted person can run 50 miles or something, right? So it's interesting how these things are sociologically conditioned. And then also people determine their family structures, their community structures, and different things relative to these notions of gifted. But they are framed. And again, what I find interesting with the Bildung is the suggestion that many of the ways that people's ideas of giftedness are framed are actually setting them up for big other authoritarianism and the inability to handle complexity, precisely because they are taught that they are gifted in complexity. That's kind of the irony, is that if you like, it's like telling people they have a high IQ and they're fragile. Actually, if the school system is saying, yes, the world is complex, but you've now got 100, you've got A plus and you can handle complexity. Well, then when they go out into pluralism and actually encounter people who are different from them, blue collars, Republicans, Democrats, they actually can't handle it. And I think there's a similar phenomenon where people are led to believe that they have a high IQ and that they have a high IQ and therefore they're fragile. I actually think something similar happens with complexity, difference, pluralism, and all of that. People are led, you're cosmopolitan and you've traveled and you've seen difference, so you're ready for it. But then you encounter real difference, which for me is often when people disagree with you morally or in terms of values. And nah, they're the devil. You can't actually handle it. There's some sort of parallel there I think about. But let me give it to Javier, Samuel, Jurij, and then Mr. Jochen. Javier, it is good to see you today, sir.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting topic. I didn't. I mean, the hermeneutical circle, right? This this IQ business. I think there's like a popular video on YouTube. It's like Jubilee. Jubilee's done a couple of these videos, where they get like a group of people. They're like, uh, the way the show starts, it's like a random group of people, and then they all judge each other about like who's gonna have the highest IQ. And it's kind of funny because one of them is like, well, I have a doctorate, so I'm obviously gonna have the highest IQ. Um, and she ended up having like I think like I don't know one of the lower brackets of IQ. Um, and like the the guy that they judged, I guess like that was in the army, he ended up having like one of the highest IQs. And it was a pretty funny video because just showing the discrepancy of judgment. But like Michael said, right, it's judging a certain form of intelligence, right? Um, if it's something like pattern recognition and how solving that's like, I mean, what's really funny about that is like that's really like a lot of what we do. But that's like a lot of like, I mean, just to bring back Heidegger into this conversation, like that would be like kind of similar to like circumspection. It would just be like the things that we do and able to solve without really much effort. It wouldn't really take like a cognitive kind of looking at, so to speak. Um, so basically, whoever doesn't break the mode of circumspection has the highest IQ. Because it's the person that has to break out of circumspection to look at it and try to solve with all of their abilities, that they're probably less likely to have whatever mode of intelligence. That's just like a Heideggerian take. I'm curious about whether that actually matches up, but I'm sure it's way more complicated than that. But actually, this notion of grit, though, is really good because Nietzsche says something about the myth of genius, too. Nietzsche was like, yeah, genius isn't a real thing. It's just straight up just an obsession and hard work. Like, like it's just you have an obsession and there's just nothing but hard work into that. But I wonder if there's a myth of hard work, too. Because what do we mean by hard work? What do we mean by hard work? Like, what is exactly hard work in this sense? And then And then yeah, so the myth of the genius seems to be parallel to the, gifted child kind of thing. I've heard definitely plenty of stories of like, guys that were saying that they're gifted and, they're like, yeah, I'm gifted, but like, I'm homeless and I don't really have anything to do with my life. So being gifted, then taking Daniel's social relevance kind of insertion in there, right? Like being gifted back in like tribal ages would be like the guy that can, always kill that deer like 3 miles away with the arrow, right? Um, so social relevance, what would be, even if I were to entertain the idea of genius today in terms of social relevance, I can't even say that word. Relevance. I can't say it. Relevance. We're missing the L. Relevance. If we're in it would be, it would actually wouldn't be pattern recognition. It would be solving the crisis or whatever. That would be it would be, overcoming capitalism. That would be, the genius, so to speak. Who can overcome capitalism? But of course, even in the midst of me saying that, I'm still asserting some type of value as to in relation to what I think would be the importance of where the genius would be situated in. So that's still like the problematic issue there. Um, yeah. So just to recap, what do we mean by hard work? If we were to entertain a genius, what would their social relevance be? Where would they be situated? What would their genius be, aiming towards? It can't be simply pattern recognitioning and quick puzzle solving. It would have to be something aimed towards something very specific that society needs that would raise them to this pedestal if we're entertaining that. Yeah.
No, excellent. Well, it's funny because, a few things come to mind. So you almost got terms like elite, skilled, gifted. Personally, I prefer terms like skilled and elite. Because like when I think, like I look at it, like Haven is really good at memorize, like he did acting and he can just remember all the lines for his play. And I cannot do that. I have never been able to memorize lines and like do acting or something. He also is continually coming up with really funny, punny jokes where he plays on words. I have no ability in that whatsoever. So I'd say Haven is very skilled at that, right? And maybe the IQ is testing a certain cognitive skill. One of the reasons I don't like the word genius personally is because I think it's very head on the stick. Oh, you're a genius, you're a head on the stick. When really I think we see people are skilled, right? Like someone who's like IQ seems to be testing a skill that is incredibly valuable. And if you have, there's a higher probability you will get ahead in 2025 technological society, right? I do think the IQ, certainly up to about 110, as I understand it, correlates with success, right? But also it's difficult because the IQ is simultaneously testing a certain skill, right? Because like it just seems like there are different skills and elites, like, and then the word elite can be better once we connect it with skill because one is elite because they are skilled, right? Now, of course, maybe they were born with 120 IQ that they tied together with skill, found something. You also have to like, to say some very general things. From what I can understand from my readings of various biographies, you need to be born to good parents. You don't want, it's quite a setback if you have abusive parents, right? Like there are different advantages, right? And I'm not saying if you're born without parents, there are some people that were born without parents that managed to be very successful, right? But if we're speaking general patterns, there are ideas of the ability of having a certain, well, certainly if you have an aristocratic education, like a tutor when you're young, that seems to be a big difference, right? But what's very interesting is someone who has like an aristocratic tutor may not actually have an incredible IQ, but by having that aristocratic tutor for so long, starting off the bat, that makes a massive deal, right? Because actually the culture that you absorb in your younger years before 10, that you say, oh, well, people just read books. That's just what you do. Oh, education is just conversation. That's just what you do. That seems to have a big deal, right? So then there's a chicken or egg problem. Is it, oh, well, the reason they had aristocratic education one-on-one is because they had a high IQ or they could handle it? Or was it more of a reverse, right? You get all these things kind of mixed together, right? But it also seems like you need social relationships. You need to know the right people. You need to not die in a freak accident. Like, arguably the smartest person in the Cambridge Bloomberry group was actually Dave Ramsey was his name. He came up, like, he died at like 23, but Keynes and Wittgenstein, all these people were like, yeah, that's the super genius over there, Ramsey. But he died. He was swimming. He cut his leg on something and died. But there's this hyper genius that we've tragically lost named Mr. Ramsey. So there are a bunch of factors here. But I guess when I think about gifted as more of kind of skill, and skill is something you have to have some seemingly innate disposition to it, but also you need to work at it, and also you need to like find the niche that you can hook it into. Also, too, I agree that hard work is problematic, because I know a lot of people that work very, very hard and don't necessarily have a lot of money or necessarily climb the ladder. The system today, capitalism is more of risk work. You need to work hard while also taking a risk in a certain capacity where you can gain social capital and opportunities, right? It's to say hard work doesn't necessarily capture the multivalent dynamics that you need to engage with, right? Capitalism today, more so, in my opinion, rewards investment and risk. And if you don't do those sort of things, you can work very, very hard, but you actually will have a cap to your gains, right? So there's a lot of factors like that. And I do think the last thing I'll say, and then I'll give it to Barnes, is that there's also a long tension looking at Pierre Bourdain, a lot of the sociologists in the books like Distinctions, that say there has always been an incentive for the elite class to define what they do as a matter of innate genius, because then nobody is going to try to work hard and take their place, right? If it's innate that they're a genius, well then, there's class structures are solid, right? There's nothing that anyone can do. And then, of course, there's breeding within that class for everyone that follows that rubric, so that social structure doesn't go away, right? At the same time, it does seem to be the case that there is something about work. It becomes like a caste system. That's correct. Exactly right. And actually, people like the book Distinctions shows how there's always been incentive for the elite class to reify the idea of a static genius, because then what's the point of opposing them, right? They're God-given, basically, right? So that's there, but then there's also a danger in suggesting there's no such thing as elitism at all, right? The question becomes, what is the basis of that elitism? Is it risk? Is it skill? Is it a combination of hard work? There's many, many factors that has to be thought of. And I think basically it is very difficult to even think of these problems. Well, this would go back to build on. It's very difficult to even think of this multidimensionality if you have a school system that is basically not creating an incubation of the exploring of these different dimensionalities, is something that the Nordic system is talking. That has to be elaborated on, but I'll stop there and give it to Samuel, Jurij, and then Mr. Jukic. Samuel Barnes, is a treat to have you, sir. Thank you for coming. And I like your lighting background. It's really cool.
I know, I got new lights today. Owen was complaining when we were doing Schizo that the lights were too distracting, so I went for something static. And I also wanted to make it look less like a disco.
Oh, and everyone, Schizo FM is like the best show on, like the best radio pot. Like, I love Schizo FM. It's amazing. So thank you for being here, Samuel.
Nice. I like the IQ discussion because it reveals a lot about people's personality. It kind of exposes who is a more particularist thinker, is okay with saying yes and no to things, and who is a more relativistic thinker who wants to kind of, maybe be more inclusive, these sorts of things. I think it's just interesting. It lets you learn more about the people who you're around. But on that, regardless, I do kind of reject the IQ stuff. And I'll tell you the reason why is it's not because, it's all about abstract reasoning, that sort of stuff, fine. But it's a little bit outmoded, I think, because it's kind of like an early 20th century, maybe even before that kind of way of looking at anthropology. It's like outmoded, I think. I think personality measurements are way more useful. I would say useful in the 20th century, because I think actually, like you alluded to this, Daniel, that you get to a certain level in IQ measurement, and then for some reason these measures of traditional success seem to drop off at like 110. And it's in, yeah, like income over life, like loads of like metrics of traditional success seem to drop off at that point. And I think it's because anything above that is correlated with lower conscientiousness and higher neuroticism. So as a result, you're not a cog that could fit into the human-centered capitalism of the 20th century. And going back to risk, actually, having an high IQ for that reason, for those personality traits, having an high IQ is actually a high risk strategy, which is why, yes, you do have successful people with high IQ, but for every successful person who invented something and went from 0 to 1, technologically speaking, there are hundreds and hundreds who are living in their parents' basement. Like this is just how I guess the human evolutionary system has fitted into the modern world. But again, I'm still in the 20th century. I'm still talking about the 20th century. We've got to move forward here and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because in the last couple of years, we've removed the need for conscientious knowledge work. There's an A word that people want to use here, but that's not what it is. People are describing this thing wrong, okay? We have this thing that doesn't care about conscientiousness because it doesn't sleep, it doesn't need food, it doesn't whatever, doesn't have a personal life, but can reliably produce around like 110 IQ knowledge work, basically. It can write legal documents with greater reliability than a human person. And basically what I'm trying to say here is that we've shifted from a human-centered capitalism to a non-human-centered capitalism. And I almost think the IQ discussion that's like a 19th century discussion. The personality discussion was the 20th century discussion. And now you can call it post-capitalism, you can call it non-human, you can call it whatever you want. But it seems evident to me that because of computing, we've entered something new. And that also has implications for education, because like Daniel was saying, like every child could have a personal tutor, like a decent personal tutor with enough knowledge of every bit of human knowledge that's ever had. But I think humanity has to have a real look at itself and not be worried about IQ numbers and traditional success, because that's not the world we're living in anymore. Like we live in 21st century is going to be wild, and you ain't seen nothing yet.
No, I think that's very well put. And I love that point that the IQ discussion unveils different personality types. That's fantastic. And I think you're right about that. That's really wonderful. I also think, like you were saying, on high IQ is a high risk strategy. I often think, and I'll give it to Jurij and Thomas, we often show the triangle, like bottom and the top is like, IQ correlates with going to the top. I actually think most of the time, I can't prove this, but I think most of the times it's more like a diamond, where actually the very strategies that get you at the top are also the ones at the very bottom, right? Like, and you see that, like you say with IQ, like a lot of people, you would actually be better off sometimes to just be in the 110 range than the 140, because actually the amount of 140 people that just end up, well, in a funny way, a lot of people that say are really, really, really into, say, the abstract pattern finding, for example, are happy to just work as a bartender, and then in their own time work on those projects, right? Or to actually isolate alone, because they actually find these projects so fascinating. Now, it would be interesting here to bring in the factor of happiness. Maybe those people are actually, better off because they're able to do a blue collar job and actually fill their time with interested problem solving, and they don't need millions upon millions of dollars, right? But regardless, there are just interesting dynamics that form that are hard to predict, right? So the moment you start talking about success, It's like, well, of course, what is success, right? If you're able to, there you go, high risk strategies, exactly. If you're able to just work a simple blue collar job, or, you live on 40K or something, and, life is happy, are you successful? Even though on maybe a successful rubric, it would say, oh man, you really just ended up mediocre. But maybe some of these high IQ people actually figure out that no, that's actually a better way, because it creates more time energy, to use Dave's term, where I actually can work on the things I want to. So it becomes a very complicated picture. But often, this is what I guess I would say, is when you're often engaging a trait that leads to high success, I often think that actually that very trait that leads to high success actually also has a reverse position on the diamond, because it's not always just like risk taking. Someone who is able to take risk, well, a lot of people who are very successful have a ability to take risk. Well, those same people are people that take risk also on the bottom of the triangle, because they lose everything in a margin call or something, right? So these things have to, and like high personability, people who are very open to others. Peterson talks about high openness. Well, I suspect openness can correlate with success, but then openness can also result in you being taken advantage of, because you're open, you're not able to put barriers, and you're just kind of walked over, right? So every single thing that can correlate with success, I often just believe a lot of the way the data is set, where it's only showing the top of the triangle per se, I often think it needs to be a diamond, right? To actually show that often it's more multivalent. The very things that lead to success also in a different context lead to failure, right? It's more like a freaking diamond. The last thing I'll say, and then give it to Jurij, is on that idea of the non-human. Steve King, an economist out of Australia, he kind of a neo-Keynesian thinker. He critiques Marx. So, there's some problems with this idea, but, Marx's whole concept of surplus value is that the way that you generate profit is surplus value, right? You pay the workers less than the total value you create, and you capture the surplus. Now, I think this idea is very simplistic. I have a lot of issues for it, but I think Keen's point is very important. He says, well, for Marx, that meant that there was a surplus value that was denied to the workers, and that would lead eventually to a revolution, and so on and so forth. He said, well, Keen said, well, actually, the ultimate surplus value creation is a machine. The machine makes all this way more surplus value than any person, and they're never going to revolt. So his point was that the logic of capital was actually toward machine and turning people into machines, which is what I would associate with what you're saying, Barnes, on less human. I think you're exactly right. I think the system increasingly selects for less human, sleep less, needs relationships less, able to just get on with, solving problems that make money on their own. And of course, AI is lurking in all of this, of course. The system actually wants, in a very real way, more machine-like activity, because that's the ultimate source of surplus value. And of course, this is alluding to Mikey Downs' work on the movement of capital into Nick Land and all of that different stuff. And I know his book is coming out very soon. But I think Stephen King's idea that the logic of surplus value does not lead to a worker revolution. It leads to a machine society, a society where all work is done by technology, which then we would want to perhaps have different gauges of success versus testing people to see how machine-like they are. Because let me put it this way. A lot of our tests to determine who's going to be successful might just be determining who is most like to be like a machine. Because that is ultimately what will get you the most surplus and success in the society. The more machine-like you are, the more money you'll make. Oh, okay, cool. And that, I think, is actually what we unintentionally select without realizing it. Certainly, once you set up 20-year-olds to have to sacrifice getting married or having kids in order to make money, does that not seem a bit machine-like? Is there not a certain movement toward a certain isolation? Because a machine, what's a key characteristic of a machine? It doesn't have to relate. It may need to be networked. It may need to be complicated and work with a bunch of things, but it doesn't have to relate. And that's one of the reasons why it makes so much money, because you don't have to bother with those kind of pesky things. But let me pass it to the wonderful Jurij. Jurij, it is beautiful to see you, my friend.
What I'm thinking about is multiple modes of intelligence and how that's being shown by AI specifically, where we are like, okay, sure, LLMs are general intelligence, but within this thing which we consider general intelligence is actually kind of like very specific way, and like the way you prompted, the way it responds, and then it has various metrics on like how it is being gauged. And then you have different types of neural network models. So like you have whatever image generation models, voice models, various kinds of artificial intelligence, which are like specialized for different tasks. And even within the class of LLMs, you have different, kinds of models. And so you have like this like multiplicity of machine sort of intelligences which are able to do a thing which they're like specifically made to do. And I kind of like connect this, well, obviously to human intelligence, but then also like there's this guy Michael Levin who's been making the podcast rounds, and he is making the argument that like intelligence, or like basically he is not saying, I'm not sure if he's saying the word intelligence, but something like which sort of goal an organism or a system is able to achieve. And like the larger the goal the system is able to achieve, we could maybe say it's more intelligent, right? But then he makes it an empirical thing with like systems from very, very low, level of like one cell or multicell or embryo, or like, a tissue or something. And he gives them a specific environment in which they can exercise their own agency, right? And so he's like, well, like there's so much latent potential which we may not even understand because it has not been put in the environment where this potential is actualized. And so, for humans, it's like, well, Warren Buffett not having been able to do that in like, in a tribal society, and now given this environment, he is actually very successful. And so the question is like, what then we can like actually empirically test these things, right? Like what sort of intelligences show up given different environments? And it's no longer a philosophical question, it's an empirical question. You can test it at every scale. Like you can test it from like, lowest like single cell organisms, or like, specific neural networks, or humans or babies, etc. And you can just put them in different environments and see what kind of intelligence shows up where you're not the one who's predefining the sort of intelligence, but you're just like letting them, sort of go towards their own goal. Yeah.
Brilliant. And Mr. Luber, wherever you are, I know you're here for a minute. Like that would be spot on. You could connect that with the notion of what he calls theme. And it's also the question of like IQ, like success being tied to the ability to recognize theme. But to stick it on Levin, that notion of different environments, realizing different latent potential, to me, one of the critical characteristics of the Bildung education movement is that that's basically what they're saying. It's like education is more about putting kids in different environments. Like you get different results with different environments. I'll talk about the medium condition. The kind of like mediums, William Ong, Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman. If you give kids TV, you see a different intelligence than if you give them internet, if you give them writing, none of which are necessarily bad. They all have trade-offs. But intelligence, way more thinking, because intelligence might be a loaded word. Potential is way more tied to architecture, like Alexander, like Christopher Alexander, like the environments that you put people in is way more of a factor in how they develop than here's the critical thing, than any individual variable. Grit, IQ, emotional intelligence, social, all of those are secondary actually to the environment in which all of those things are being incubated in. If you don't think about the environment, the medium, the structure in which you are putting people to learn, then you're just going to be moving around variables and emphasis within the same set per se. So if you have the same environment, and here you emphasize emotional intelligence a little more and IQ a little less, and you have the same environment, but over here you do IQ a little more and emotional less, there will be difference, but not really, dare I say, difference in kind or radical difference or like, a real newness, if you will. Certainly nothing that could fall into something like an emergence in a kind of term, because I know Levin talks about the xenobots and all those different things, right? Like if we're in an issue where, as so many people are saying now, AI is causing an educational crisis, the way you address that is by thinking of new environments of education, new spaces of education, not merely new information or different emphases. Because there's an emphasis trap here. Because I see people now going, okay, AI is going to change everything. So let's emphasize social intelligence, or let's emphasize creativity, right? But it's still happening within the same test structure, the same kind of way of going to school, the same assumptions of getting a job after 25. No, that's not going to work. You cannot bring about new latent potential by merely shifting the emphasis or changing, like an emphasis shift will not change new latent potential. You need new design, new environments, like the Bildung, or an education that is not trivia based but oral based, like we talk about with Neil Postman, or one that is actually taking place where you're literally putting kids in a garden and doing projects of a Montessori. Like, these are different models of education, different mediums. You will never, ever, ever unlock new latent potential, because I think Levin is spot on with that. You will never unlock that by just changing the emphasis. And I think a mistake, and then I'll give it to Jock and Michael and then Javier, a mistake that people are falling into now is going, AI is coming, okay, well, let's change the emphasis in the school. But the institutions are the same. The schooling structure is the same. The way teachers teach is the same. The pipeline is the same, right? No, you have to change the model as a whole if you want different latent potential. You can't just shift the emphasis. Yes, Jurij, please.
Yeah, just one more thought on genius in this context. I would consider genius being the person who's able to seek out those environments in which their own latent potential is the most actualized. So it's like a certain, like we're all, I mean, kind of, we all have the internet, right? And like most of Western civilization, you could say, is like kind of exposed to the same thing, or like the same interface. If you like, are like, you can manipulate your own algorithm the way you like, right? So like you get to like choose your own interface kind of, and you have this like, you can like find a parallax, or like there's like a reality has like multiple filtered views, and the genius is the one who can find that like specific filtered view for them, or like some filtered view which nobody else can see, and use that as their environment for action, like use that for like how they operate, right? And like even in the context of capitalism, like the risk takers and the hard workers, like if you're like doing something interesting, like a new strange project which has a lot of potential, you need to find the right parallax against the world. You need to find the right specific kinds of knowledge with which you interact with. It kind of like goes back to the genius being imperceptible to anybody else, or like, skill is like hitting the target like spot on, and then genius is, finding the target which nobody else can see. And so like one skill which is really important to develop is like attunement or search, or for different parallaxes to reality.
I think that's brilliant. I think the idea that if the word genius is valid, it has something to do with the degree of the ability to recognize the, I'll say, environment in which your latent potential is realized, which is a remarkable feat, because one, you have to recognize a latent potential is there, and then there's an idea of recognizing what kind of environment realizing it. It's like a double thought move that's going on. I definitely think, when I keep talking about this Bildung in the Nordic, I definitely think that was the huge emphasis, is the idea that it is not enough simply to be skilled in whatever environment is given by the zeitgeist. There's this real emphasis on being able to recognize like who you are, not in a like a vague Socratic no, who are you? Like, what is the potential within you? And then being able to discern where that's going to come out. And for me, I also associate that kind of education, when we've talked before about the liminal web, when we talked about a social coordination mechanism that we're seeing online. I strongly associate that with basically training the spaces in which people actually oddly learn that discernment. Because here's the weird thing. That double move, which I've also called a meta judgment, the ability to judge the thing in which you are making judgments, to discern the structure in which your discernments are being trained. It's a kind of meta move in addition to the content. How do you learn that? Where does that come from? Do you have it or don't you have it? And the reason I like that question is because when we ask the old question, is genius or success, is it nature nurture, right? That's often where the conversation gets stuck. Is it nature nurture, right? I don't know if that ever goes anywhere, but if we ask the question, is meta judgment, if you grant my language, is that nurture nature, right? I see no evidence that it isn't both. And of course the answer is always both. But no, I mean like deeply both, meaning like you have to have some people that even make you aware that you're a fish in water. Then you also have to learn how to swim, but also able to think of the whole at the same time. And I don't know of anyone in history who has not gained that without encountering some tutor at a young age, some friend by chance at Cambridge, some devastation that made them look at, there's something that has to happen in their environment, but this goes to your point, Jurij, that activates something that is within them, which you could associate with nature, but the nurturing per se activated the nature. And I've never seen it just be one or the other. There is always, especially when you look at like Randall Collins and all these different things. So there's a bothness going on here that seems really profound that I think we can get at better when we're taking seriously this architectural point. Jurij, did you want to say, please?
So I'm reading this guy Chogyam Trungpa, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, who's like a Buddhist teacher who came to the West and is like considered a crazy wisdom teacher. And he talks about, how how the interaction between the student and the guru and like their sort of spiritual friendship unfolds. And it's very similar to how you described like environment giving you something which invokes a latent potential within you. But there's this like really big emphasis on nakedness from both sides, where there is like the student has to let go of a certain pretense of what they're trying to get or like what they're trying to achieve in order for themselves to open up for the slap in the face from the environment or like a hug from the environment or whatever it is that will wake up their latent potential. And there's like these stories of like a student like from whatever his like Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, right? And like these stories of like these great masters and how they became that. And like so a student goes to he wants to learn Buddhism, etc. And so he goes to the master, he's like, okay, teach me this. And then the master's like, okay, whatever, earn this much money, come back to me in a year. And then the student does that, and again and again and again. And at the end, like, okay, the student gives literally everything and has gained nothing, right? Like, what the fuck? And then the master just like slaps him in the face, and he just like completely gives up. And there's like this element of like letting go of pretense and effort and like what you expect to get back from things, and actually becoming naked and exposing yourself and opening yourself up to the other, which is an incredibly vulnerable thing to do. And you kind of sort of have to go through the motions of like exhausting your desire for whatever you think is important.
I think that's a brilliant point. If the word genius means anything, it's on the other side of nakedness. And the problem is we actually use genius to clothe ourselves. That's the problem. Like the way we talk about genius in modern society is often hiding or putting on armor or defending yourself. But what we learn, and look, we have going through purgatory, subjective destitution, cross, the slap on the face, like you're saying, there's this long lineage of suggesting that if the word genius means anything, is on the other side of nakedness. That seems to be something that is really emphasized in many spiritual traditions. Whereas in more economic, technological societies, genius is what saves you from having to go through nakedness. Nakedness is evidence that you're not a genius because you're naked. You must be dumb, right? But actually here it's on the other side of it. And there is something interesting about nakedness. Like if, on that old, how do you know other people exist? How do you know there are other minds out there? Well, just take off your clothes. You'll know that they're real quick, right? There's something about nakedness that verifies the other. Right? Like, and that's often if they're torturing someone or they're really trying to humiliate someone, they take off their clothes in a public space, right? And it's like a big humiliation. It makes me think of Being in Nothingness by Sartre and the pinning down, right? Well, what's interesting about that move is it's fundamentally a meta move. And we were just saying earlier that in order to find your environment where there's a latent space, there's a meta judgment that occurs, right? Because the moment you have nakedness, you feel seen by something outside of you. Why are you bothered by your nakedness? You look at yourself in the mirror naked, it doesn't bother you. It's when it's other people see you, then there are other people. Well, guess what? You just entered in a very profoundly empathetic move. You just left your frame and acknowledged the existence of something beyond your frame. Oh, turns out then that environments exist, architectures exist. There is something structural. And there's just something about it isn't until you're devastated that you actually think of structures. as multiple, as different options. You just think there is the structure, right, of, say, making money. But the spiritual teacher is like, you're a fish in water and you don't know that you're in water. So they smack you. And once you do that, then you've had the meta move. So on the other side of the nakedness, I think, is a profound point. But let me give it to Mr. Jukic, and then Michael, and then Javier. Mr. Jukic, it is good to have you here today, sir. I hope the ice hasn't been too bad your way.
I'm glad you can make it through, Daniel, and I'm glad to be with everybody here. Great conversation as usual. I think so much was said, so I've just bypassed my notes. I think a lot of what I'm hearing here is this idea of relevant realization from Vervaeke, for example. So the idea here is that when you change the context, basically qualities and attributions that were useless in one context become useful. And in fact, the same action or the same capacity can actually be transformed, become more valuable, or just completely shifted. So for example, at one point, everybody farmed. 80% of the population, 90% of the population farmed. Now less than 1% do, for example. The activity still occurs, but just has been deferred to a much smaller population to handle it. Or even things like athletics, like kind of athleticism. So at one point it was under the parameter of hunting. Now it's under the parameterization of sports, athletics. And that's interesting because its real value is not the activity of the sport, it's the power of being televised and being used as an instrument of entertainment for a population. That's the value of the athlete, which is thus justifying why it gains so much income. So that's interesting that the same capacity by transformation of a different relevance realization or frame of valuation completely transforms it. This is usually why marketing is half the battle in any business venture. It doesn't matter how good your product is. If you don't solve distribution and market fit in terms of legibility of value, it has no value. It has no value, at least from a marketing point of view. So I just found that interesting, is that the same capacity in action can be transformed by changing the context. And it tends to be usually the sign of a leader. A leader is someone who sets up a new context from the old parameterization, which is usually takes huge risk. There's gigantic cognitive dissonance. There's usually resistance about it. And then it's a cheat. And then when success comes, then everything retroactively transforms where it was obviously the case. It's very much survivor bias, right? Which is the whole point, right? This whole conversation about high-risk actions is that we always remember the success ones, but we forget about the 99 that failed, right? So I think that's an important detail here. But that's the point. But the thing is, as a society, we've concluded that we need to do that. And we generally structure society to manage that as best it can. So, for example, the development of the limited liability corporation is an example of that. So basically, the argument there is your financial risk should be handled by a corporation, not an individual. So that way, if it does go bust, you get to continue to survive. So you get multiple exposures to risk taking. Now, that's very different from financialization of huge speculative investments of capital that cause basically kind of tulip mania or other things like that. But that's in terms of a society structure, that tends to be what we do. But isn't it interesting, by the way, this whole discussion of IQ? I totally agree with this idea of like a piece of clothing we put on, an armor we on of identity, right? This is not wisdom. This is prudence at best. This is prudence. It's being clever. And that's the thing. As I was going to comment about context domain, there's very clever people in jail. Very clever people. You'd be amazed how much ingenuity and creativity you'll find in jail. I've seen documentaries where it's amazing the things they have to do to survive and basically make the best of a bad situation. But that's the point, but yet society has already decided, no, we're not gonna, that is not gonna be utilized, that creativity. So I just think about this is really about prudence at best, the application of a universe to some abstraction to a particular context, which is why I'm bringing this idea of like frame relevance in terms of how we navigate society. And I think, by the way, there's no that tutors, it's been known in education for a very long time. We know what works in terms of gaining maximum output in terms of education. It's tutoring. 101s are number one rule of success. If you want to really see massive improvement in outcomes, you tutor. That's just the rule. It just works so much more effectively than even a small class group. And it's obvious why. Partly because the individual tutor usually identifies problems that individual and meets the optimal fit for that subject, right? And also there's the issue of direct relationship and expectation. That's a huge one. So the idea that you have to show up to this person and be directly confronted by one person that you did the homework, you did the thing, or you didn't do the thing, versus a generalized homogenization kind of abstraction that occurs when you're in a large classroom. So I mean, that's the problem, is that basically we know what works, but we can't scale that. That's fundamentally what's happened here. So some people propose things to solve that. Some people think AI can do that. I'm a little on the fence about it because, for example, like I'm doing tutoring. I'm actually being tutored right now in programming, and let me tell you what, I try to use AI. I try to use ChatGPT and whatnot to try to get me through that, like in terms of stopping blockages or issues. No, because their entire parameters are just concepts I didn't understand that ChatGPT couldn't address. I was just stuck, and it took my tutor to just say, "Oh yeah, it's this," and they very rapidly solved the problem, like address the issue that I didn't understand. So I've heard conversations about AI being this kind of direct tutor, like kind of a digital Socrates, basically. But I mean, I haven't seen that experience really pan out. There is something about the individuation of instruction that does make a big difference. I think also just the last note, isn't it interesting how much it actually related? And actually, this is why I'm bringing about prudence, is because a lot of the notes about it, like kind of the quick wit, the rapid, it's always about the speed quality. Speed and intelligence is a really interesting detail, because a lot of times the measure of it was noted a couple of times in the conversation that it's the rapidness of the answer, coming to the right answer rapidly. Aristotle talks about that. It's a very important element of inference, that quick wit to identify from premises the conclusion very rapidly, or seen from the signs in observation, the cause of the sign or the effect. That's speed, rapidity versus long duration. That's the idea of intelligence, or this kind of quality about it being time-based. It's been in a very long time, but the distinction would be that's an element of prudence, practical reasoning, right? Practical wisdom, not the kind of larger Sophia framework of what wisdom is. So interesting parts. And I think the last note just related to, I've wrote some notes about this and kind of nature of character of individuals. So I'm thinking about you, Daniel, your note about definition versus definiteness. It seems like one of the qualities of defining who a person is related to that particular, actually, bios, way of life of that individual and that environment that they exist in. Aristotle's note about this, part about the definition of like a specific of animals, like mallards or birds in certain environments, not others. So it's not typically part of the definition of the bird, but it's still part of the way of life of that animal or creature. So similarly, humans, which is I kind of one of the key distinctions, humans have that really amazing power to, via our power of society of abstraction, we can create new environments of context. So our capacities can draw out in different ways or reveal themselves in different ways. The bird can't do that. It's in the marsh. It's kind of reactively responding to it, and its character and its quality is showing through in that. Expanders of life. Versus a human, we seem to be able to transform via these abstractions of games, of employment or society structures or games, to help draw out different qualities about our substance or quality, our character, that is individuated. Because the particular how Daniel addresses the certain circumstance now, or that stock guy we brought up before. I'm blanking on the name, but the point is, like, he was useless in one point in this power of picking stocks, but now in this context he is useful. That's a transformation in his environment. Humans can do that, or society or structure can do that. And animals, non-humans, seem to not be able to do that. It's interesting. It's an interesting detail. And that's why I yield.
No, beautifully put. And I know that Zach Stein has been doing work on the question of, can AI be these kind of return of aristocratic tutor and different things like that. And I think it is icing and snowing again. So if my internet breaks up, I strongly apologize. We've been having a good time. But I don't think a pine tree is going to blow up again. The one on the power line that blew up yesterday, I think that was the only one. Well, so I say. But I know he's been talking about that. But certainly with ARC, like, there's something about using the technology if the child is innately interested. And Samuel, always a pleasure, Mr. Barnes. Thank you so much. And Brandon, a treat to have you. Always a delight. I hope you are doing well. And we're talking a bit on different things like gifted, IQ, nature, nurture, grit, intelligence. And we also, the point was brought up with Michael Levin on the idea that, if you put things in different environments that are actually simple, an innate latent potential comes out, and really you should focus on the environment. And also then the point arose that if we use the word genius, which is always problematic, we need to perhaps think about it more as the ability to recognize in what environment you can put yourself into to incubate your own latent potential, as opposed to simply going, oh, I am non-contingently universally able to solve anything. Because actually, to that point, what I was thinking as you were speaking, Mr. Jockin, and then I'll give it to Michael and Javier, and if anyone wants to raise their hand and say anything else, please, is like I'm always, I think you personally can be shocked by the capacities you have in different environments. So, for example, when I worked at the wholesale, if you would have told me, hey, you're going to be able to know the name of 300 different flowers, I would have said, yeah, okay, so what, dude? But actually, when you work in a wholesale that's working with 300 different flowers, you come to memorize them and don't even realize, you don't even think about it. It's not even like study. You don't have to go home at night and like memorize the list. You actually are shocked by your capacity of memorizing all of the different names of these things simply because you were put in a wholesale environment that incubated that capacity within you, right? And so likewise, I think one of the problems is when we don't have enough, I almost want to say, diversity of environments. We talk all about diversity of individual expression, but not actually diversity of environments. That's where you're shocked by new capacity. And the real problem is if you're emphasizing diversity, but everyone is actually saying generally by the same environment, the institutions, well, then they're actually not very different. And then problematically, there becomes, the guy who talks about the overabundance of elites, Paul, he's really good. Oh, dang, come to me in a minute. The guy who talks about big history and different things. You have different, what's his name, Brandon? Turchin. That's it. Exactly. Like you have all of these problems that happen where there's this and here's the critical thing, there's an overabundance of a kind of capacity that then we socially call genius, and there's going to be a lot of discontent, right? Where if there was greater diversity of environments in which people with this latent potential could realize different things, you may actually, but then you'd have to have recalibrations of money and, all of these different things. But there's this idea of there's not enough kind of different diversities of environments, architectures, spaces, ways of learning, different ways to actually bring out different latent potentials, like Levin says. Therefore, you actually have a very monoculture. What is the Collins say? Mono-urban culture or something like that, that starts to emerge. And the other thing that makes me think, the problem with, if you only have intelligence, like you've trained intelligence, then actually ultimately what intelligence can be really good at is seeing problems, like seeing where there's something wrong. Well, then this is Foucault's barbaricism of refinement. Like nothing is perfect. So if you have everyone that's smart and they don't have environments to use those different capacities for different things, they're all going to become very critical, you could say deconstructionist, and also nihilistic, right? And everyone is at the mercy of the barbaricism of refinement, or what Samuel Barnes calls the meta question, where everything is just eating itself alive, and then it has no basis in any common life, and then you have all of the self-effacement and snake eating its own tail too. So this issue too of not linking capacity to environment means that capacity will still be linked to an environment. It will just be one nobody thinks about, and you'll have a poor coordination of those capacities that ultimately will probably just lead to a world that's being eaten alive by the barbaricism of refinement or resentment or dynamics where people are, fighting one another in problematic ways. Because I definitely think, like, if you take seriously that you need to think of the different environments for the capacity, not merely different emphasizes. Like we were saying, if you're saying AI is going to replace human beings, you say, okay, well, let's just emphasize emotional intelligence and social intelligence in the pre-existing school system. An emphasis change is not an architecture change. It is not an environment change. And what you're seeing is how people think is profoundly shaped by the environments and the architectures you're in. And if you just start emphasizing creativity, but don't create a school system in which actually has incubated a different mode of thinking, well, the emphasis change isn't going to really do much. You have to create a new architecture. And then, of course, as we've like this whole thing going on online as a social coordination mechanism, a different way of coordinating society. Because another way to look at the IQ test is it's basically just a social coordination system. It is a mechanism of social coordination. How are we going to coordinate who, where in society if if and you could argue in an industrial society it was the best we could do. I don't want to necessarily say there's no place for these different things, but you always have a question of what is the mechanism of social coordination that you have now, and what we're seeing potentially online with sort of things we do here or other live or voicecraft or philosophy portal and so on and so forth is actually a means of coordinating a different mode of consciousness in a different environment that realizes different latent potentials. And so that I think is very, very important to take seriously. But I will pass it to Michael, Javier, and then anyone else who wants to speak, please. Michael.
Yeah, this is all really great. Yeah, I I have been really struck by just the common thread in this conversation of the multiple modes of intelligence and the environment being really primary to shaping our capacity to learn. And also, I think probably equally as important, and this kind of goes to the nakedness piece, is exposing all that we don't know. And I think traditional school, um, I mean, does that in a way, but I think there's this like emphasis on kind of, I don't know, shame and punishment for that, as opposed to like opening you up to wonder and things like that. Um, I think most teachers in schools, um, although they assume the role of a teacher, I don't think they really want to be a tutor. And I don't think the school system is really set up for that, as Jockin was saying, with like the one-on-one versus the classroom environment. I just remember in high school, like, it- whenever someone raised their hand, and the teachers would always like, we had someone from our library who every morning during the morning announcements, like his like tagline was like, don't be afraid to ask for help. Like, seek out the library. Don't be afraid to ask for help. There's like, we have the tutorial center, blah, blah, blah. And, but like that, like there were so many classes where if you asked for help, you'd be shamed, you'd be laughed at, like, um, or it, it wouldn't actually really be like a sign of intelligence, like to actually ask the questions. And intelligence is knowing all the answers in a traditional educational setting. I was reminded I had a personality theory professor in college who, like, the last day of class was like, if you forget everything in this class, remember like five things. And I couldn't remember the other four, but one of the ones that stuck out to me is she was like, choose your environments very carefully because they have a tremendous impact on on your ability to learn and also your ability to actualize your own potential. Um, and I think a critical skill today is, yeah, exactly, your virtue. I think a critical skill today is adaptability to different environments because the world is changing so quickly. And every day it's like it seems like, okay, what was useful yesterday is not useful today, or it has to be reshaped and rethought. And I think there's a real pull today to return to a certain ancestral type of being. And people are moving out to the woods and starting permaculture farms and living in communes and um you know uh you know living in nature, learning these traditional skills. Um, and I think part of what they're seeking is like a return to, um, not like self-reliance, but also just like um kind of the agency of task completion. And I think school is in the way it's devised, and I think that's part of like what Bildung does is like it gets kids outside, it teaches them skills with their hands, it teaches them how to like fend for themselves and ask for help in a community. Um, and just, just last thing before I wrap up, like, I lived in Wyoming for 3 months doing, invasive species removal, and I was living with like a crew of 15 people, and we were camping the entire time. And so, talk about just like throwing yourself out of the like concrete jungle of the Silicon Valley into a totally foreign environment. And I just noticed for myself and just the people around me, like the there were so many things that were just really difficult, and like people didn't know, how to do. And the people who were able to ask questions and to be vulnerable and to like be naked, as it were, like they had the highest quality of life in that 3 months. Whereas the people who like were afraid to ask, me included, in the beginning, like um it 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 just made that, it just like kind of put like a damn wall on like your ability to actually grow and like really like embed yourself in the environment. So I think that training of that is really important. I'm reminded of the Zen koan of like the empty cup, where like the student comes to the master and he's like, he thinks he knows everything, and the master, like, he asks for some tea, and the master keeps pouring and just pouring, pouring, pouring. And he's why aren't you stopping? And he's like, well, that's what it feels like trying to teach you. Is like you haven't emptied your cup. Like, I can't put anything in there if you think you know all the answers. So but yeah, this has been great. I'll pass it back.
I think that's brilliant. I'll give it to Javier, and then if anyone else wants to speak. Well, first, there's a very real sense in which genius without nakedness is extremely dangerous. Like, to make people intelligent or crafty or quote unquote educated without making them go through nakedness, emptying their cup, going through, hey, go and see if you can fix that tractor. I can't. Oh, I guess you're not so smart after all, right? Without moments of humility, it's actually quite dangerous to educate people, because then they puff themselves up. It's what David Hume talks about, the philosophical ascent, and they're just going to destroy everything because they're better than it. Well, what they're going to do is they're going to be smart enough to know how to destroy anything that could humiliate them, right? Which is, of course, authority, which is, of course, tradition, which is, of course, any sort of thing that you need to listen to be tutored by, you'll destroy. Because you'll have enough intelligence to do the barbaricism of refinement that Vico is like, will kill us all, and you'll do it. And so, without that subjective destitution, without that encounter with lack in a psychoanalytical sense, without that really realizing you're really smart, and in being really smart, you're still not that smart. Because that's the crazy thing. Like, the world has a way of saying wow, you actually are smart. It's just the case that no matter how smart you are, there's about 99.9% more that you don't know, regardless where you get to. Oh, okay, well then I guess I need to rethink what this is all about then, right? If you don't do that, if you have a highly educated society, quote unquote, which of course is always just, at best, maybe 1% of intelligence. I mean, who reads more than 0.001% of books on the planet, right? Like, if you read every single day until you die, you may get to 0.001 or something, right? It's just completely ridiculous. So what exactly is intelligence, right? Well, certainly it has no chance, in my opinion, of knowing its fittedness or what it is for without going through some sort of humbling, some sort of nakedness, some sort of vulnerability. And if the college system is designed to actually just get you a comfortable job where you make a lot of money or something and you're never humiliated, that's really dangerous, actually. Like, being humiliated in this good way should be at the heart of the school experience, or else it's dangerous. It's quite dangerous. And that's where classically you had the gymnastics, you had the wrestling, you had the outdoor. Ivan Illich is huge on all this, because basically what Illich would be like is, yeah, what you just said, Michael, if that's not part of the school system is bad. And it will ultimately become its own institutional logic. And a key word is that it will disable everyone, and then lead to all these other things. I adore Ivan Illich. So I think the other thing I would say is, you made that point between teacher and tutor. Not that I'm saying I always use this language or that I'm some sort of stickler for the right terms. I kind of associate here the teacher with the trivia that Neil Postman, like, a teacher makes you good at trivia. the ability to quickly answer random questions for a test. The tutor is more of a free speech phenomenon. The tutor, like, well, and this is why if you have an anti-free speech society, you're screwed. Jonathan Rauch talks about this in Kindly Inquisitors, because the tutor is fundamentally someone who explores ideas with you. And if there are certain ideas that are off limits, you're done. You can't have tutoring. You can only have teaching. You can only have the memorization of the information that is allowed within the bounds of what is permissible, right? Well, you know, if there is one, like, I really do think Jonathan Rauch's Kindly Inquisitor should be required reading for everyone, because people don't actually know what free speech is. They think free speech is simply expressing your opinion. No, Jonathan Rauch makes it extremely clear that free speech is the very possibility of education and intelligence. You cannot coordinate intelligence without the freedom of speech, because we have no idea what ideas are good and bad off the cuff. We have to explore. We have to talk about them. We have to think about them. Kindly Inquisitors is a extremely important book, and obviously it's a big part of Belonging Again too. And it's not, you just simply cannot have tutoring without free speech. It has to be there. And the question, of course, would be, if AI has any chance of being a tutor versus a teacher, it would require free speech. Can AI engage in free speech? Like, that's a question. Or how could it do it without losing the human element because it's a robot? And the key to free speech is it's not prompted. It's not enter a prompt, get a result. Free speech is very organic. You say something, you don't know what the response is going to be. Someone takes it in a different direction. Like, the problem is, like, ChatGPT is not a free speaking entity. It's prompt based, right? So that's going to put limits on to what degree it can be a tutor versus a teacher, right? But we'll see. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we'll just have to see how things go. And I think also what you said on help, and then I'll give it to Javier and then Mr. Parsons. A lot of times the school has to tell you that help's available, so that when nobody uses it, it says something. If help just wasn't available, it wouldn't mean anything if you denied it, right? So you need to offer it and then make it bad to use, right? Because that actually functions as a kind of self-deception mechanism to say, yeah, we're not against help. It's just that people don't need it. Oh, okay. No, you create a social norm where that's a bad thing, right? And really one of the reasons I strongly like project-based education is because if I'm trying to put the rake on the tractor, you literally can't do it by yourself. This is the key. Like, in a work site, help is like not optional, right? Like, you literally can't fill the truck by yourself. You need the driver, you need 20 people to do it, right? So help is not a moral sign of some sort of inability. It's like the condition of social relation without which nothing happens, right? The problem with the trivia classroom structure is actually it moralizes against help. They call it cheating. You're supposed to be able to learn and memorize this all by yourself without any aid, and you'll get to the top, right? That is completely antithetical to how effing society works. Society is all about working with other people, help. You're gonna build a company by yourself. Okay, well, you can do some start, but if you want to take it to the big level, you're gonna need to have delegation, all these different things. Like, help is the logic of society. Nothing happens without it. And it's, in a sense, not even help. It's just necessity in a way. It's help as necessity versus help as option. And actually, in my opinion, by the school system training you for 20 years to think of help as a bad thing and possibly cheating, you get a subconscious association of help being bad. You bring that into your adult life. You don't get help and you like psychologically break down. Or you have this very individualistic view where you say, all my success was my own doing. And you get this very problematic individualism that can threaten community. You have community that can be threatened on both sides, right? Where you sacrifice the individual for the collective or the collective for the individual. Both can actually lead to a loss of actual community, right? Well, if like help is bad and you've been told that it's freaking bad, well, then you shouldn't need your neighbor. You should never go next door and talk to them. If you go next door and talk to them, there's something wrong, right? So you have these suburbias that are all broken down. I'll stop. But basically, we have been incubated to associate help because of the first 20 years of our lives with something bad, which subconsciously sets us up to not be communal or to make stable communities or to have like collectives that we find belonging in. And so everyone is atomized and alone and we don't have stable existences that are coherent to us. Anyway, let me pass it to Javier and then Mr. Parsons and then Jurij. And then if anyone else wants to speak, just raise your hand. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, so man, yeah, gotta bring Heidegger in here. It's funny because we're talking about the how do you see yourself out, inside of as the fish in the water, in the tank, how do you even catch that kind of moment? And this is why even talking like nature nurture kind of conversation it gets kind of silly from the Heideggerian point of view, only because we are our world. And if you understand that, then you can understand that actually what we're talking about when we're talking about different modes of environment, we're talking about worldhood. What are the kinds of worlds that are we capable of having? And the worlds that we have, what are the possibilities that they produce, essentially? So that's what I find really helpful about Heidegger, because he's basically saying, like, we have an understanding automatically by being thrown in the world. The problem is, and this is what's really funny, is that when we talk about understanding, people yet generally think understanding is, so you understand how to change a tire, right? You're talking about like competence. Are you competent enough to change a tire? That's not what Heidegger is talking about. And that's what most people think of. And this actually proves your emphasis problem, Daniel, about instead of changing the design, they're talking about just switching the emphasis. Okay, so that means we need to be more competent in humanities and art. Let's make that more integrative with the sciences, the hardcore sciences, right? But that's thinking competence. That's not thinking understanding from an existential point of view. The existential point of view is you've already been thrown into this world, and that is your understanding. Your understanding already pre-projects possibilities. And that means that when you say, let's just emphasize this instead of this, you're already enacting on those pre-projected possibilities precisely because of that ground that you're already in. So that's what Heidegger's saying. This is what's so hard. Like, we literally get in the way of ourselves because of this. So we can't actually see the fact that it is a design. And it is our world, so to speak. So that's why I thought it was really good when you pointed out that emphasis design distinction, which I thought was really good, because I do see that in schools now. They are trying to do like an emphasis kind of move now. The other thing is, now this is what I think will be interesting. When Barnes was talking about the human being, and we're in the age of like the non-human, essentially. Now this is what's interesting, because I think Heidegger's hermeneutical circle, how do we understand that we're in a fish in a tank, so to speak? How do we see ourselves as fish in a tank? I think can find itself in the material realization of how far AI goes. Like, I can expand on this. So like, what's really funny is throughout all of history, we've started, using technology, but it's always been like in a kind of Heideggerian way, like ready to hand. It's for us to produce more, be efficient, help with labor. But now AI gets into the picture, and now it's like a question of intelligence. Now it's a question of intelligence. It's no longer just like mere productivity. It's now a question of intelligence, which was what we were before. So it's really interesting about the way the human being looks at itself and then doubles itself. So what I'm saying is that technology can acts as a doubling to the human being, essentially. So when the human being was treating itself as a working machine, it created all these, utilities. But now when now that we've gone into the stage of past that, we're talking about intelligence now. The human being has been treating itself as an intelligent machine. And then what's going to be even funnier about that is that I fear and I don't know if this is going to be the necessary route or not, but what I fear is that it will have to become so machine-like that eventually we say, hopefully, it jars us out of our, and I think it's already kind of happening a little bit, right? It jars us out of our understanding that we are the fish in the fish tank that have been treating ourselves as machines. And then this is the move that every sci-fi movie makes. We start making the AI human as possible, which is hilarious because and this is a perfect, to me, this is, I think may be inevitable. And I'll say why, because it's going to be the only thing that's going to redouble as the meta move to help us see the mistake that we're making when we interpret what is human being. So that means that the AI is the only thing, perhaps in the future, that will make us question being itself as we construct what that means. So every time we're not satisfied with it being human, quote, it being human enough, it makes us reinterpret what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human then? And we're going to be doing the same thing. So that the AI will act as a doubling feature for us to basically come up with a new design, which is really funny. It makes us come up with a new design for the AI. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you said it. It made me think, Michael was bringing up the idea of a question and the ability to question in school. For me, there's a way in which a question is a kind of meta space. When you seriously ask a question, it is a kind of space that you are in. And we've been saying that spaces with Michael Levin realize different latent potentials. And so it's like, if you're good at asking questions, and this is where I think like the character of the social coordination mechanism online, which seems to be focused much on humanities, philosophy, questions, thoughts, and different things, that's really important because questions are spaces that bring out different latent potentials. That applies even to engineering. Like you go, well, how do we make a toaster that is able to cook like 20 things of bread at the same time? Well, you then occupy a certain space where you tinker around and try to figure that out or something, or a new lawnmower, right? Like there is something about questions that are spaces. And if you have a school system that makes you feel bad to ask questions, because what if you ask questions that are, frowned upon or, socially unjust or some of that sort of stuff? Well, then you stop asking questions. You see questions as threat. And therefore, there cannot be a meta environment, I suppose, that actually unlocks different latent potential. So this is another reason why getting rid of free speech is extremely dire, because I don't think you can have a questioning society without free speech, because you have to know you can speak freely to question. If that is not given, people will not ask questions. It's just too dangerous. They'll only ask questions within the parameters set by the institutions, which means that the only latent potential that will be realized will be isomorphic to the overall zeitgeist or culture, which could be the barbaricism of refinement in a funny way. I think what you're saying is therefore AI can have this ability of making you ask questions about yourself that creates a new environment that can realize different latent potential, but it depends on how the questions are asked. And again, going back to the Nordic Secret book, Thomas Borkman, Leah Anderson, there's this idea that basically when they talk about inner capacity, which is not merely intelligence, it would be the ability to handle those kind of questions, right, without being destroyed. Right. So you encounter AI and you say, well, what's the human being without inner capacity, to use their phrase, or maybe psychological richness, as a Besser might talk about or something. Then what happens is you go, oh my gosh, what's the human? And it's actually not it's a nervousness. It's not a space of exploration. It's a kind of tunneling in that leads to a compression and all of the problems with that, right? To actually go, AI can do all this. Well, what's the human then? And it actually be a space that realizes the latent potential that you design and work on, that requires some sort of inner capacity. And the idea of the Bildung that the Nordic nations put forward is that actually can be trained, and it can be given to the peasantry, to farmers. It doesn't have to be given to the elites. That's why that particular education program is extremely interesting to me. Now, again, there are limits and problems with it, and Leanne Anderson talks about all that. But that idea that if you simply create the environment that gives people the inner capacity to handle questions and they get good at asking questions, that is enough to realize a latent potential that is extremely powerful, right? And then between 1815 and 1950, they have all of the successes that they have. But of course, as they note, Leanne, they're all quite clear that the Nordic nations between 1815 and 1950 are different than today, right? So they talk about all that. But I think also, like you're saying, yeah, I mean, there's also the idea, I think, with the AI, I guess I'll say this and then give it to Jurij. There's also something about, let's say AI entails the book within it that if you read, you would know, and Michael, good to see you, sir, and it's truly a pleasure. Like, let's say AI in its black box contains the book that has the answers to all problems, or the Borgias Alpha in that short story or something like that, right? Well, it might actually be the case that you could only understand the concepts of it after another 300 years of learning, right? Like if I were to take a book on quantum mechanics and drop it into 1780 society, it literally could not be intelligible because there are so many steps you have to take to be able to even understand the idea of quantum, right? Like there's always that, the book on Did the Greeks Believe Their Myths talks about this and different things, right? So there's also an idea that there's a timing element to your work, Javier, of when ideas come out. So even if AI entails all of the possible books that it could ever be written in its black box, that actually in of itself doesn't really matter unless it is timed in a manner that you can actually climb those steps, right? So there's a timing issue. But how in the world do you know the timing, right? Well, that's where the architectures and the ability to question and to flexibly make new spaces is really, really important. Time design, as you just said, and design are really tied together. Like even if you go, what's the point? The book I'm going to write, AI could write better. I'm sure AI has belonging again in it somewhere or something like that. Yeah, but we don't know the prompt by which to make belonging again come out. And we also don't know when it would realize that and how it would be able to word those arguments in a manner that would actually meet people in the place they are to make sense of it, right? Like, again, if you give general relativity to civilization in the 1420s, you know, that there would be the conceptual apparatus has not actually worked through time to be able to absorb it. Now, that is not because they were stupider. That is not what I'm saying. Actually, they were very often way smarter. It's that the nature of learning is necessarily structured. It necessarily has a ladder to it. Because to learn C, you have to learn A first, then B, then C, then D, and it has to be ordered. You can't skip to M without having the intellectual development to get to M, right? So all AI could do is maybe speed up the process of taking the steps, but it can't skip the steps, or else it would be unintelligible to us, right? So the ability of human beings to know how to create the environments and to ask the questions that will accelerate the steps and know how to bring about the next step becomes extremely important for the human to do and to have a very real function in all of this, where if we simply say, what's the point? AI can do it better than us. Well, then we're not going to do that. Once you realize there is a fundamental timing problem, there is always a timing problem to new ideas, and the human must be the time designer per se. Well, then the human has a really important role, but it's a design role. It's not simply an emphasis role. It's an ability to actually, but here's the other trick, and this goes back to Jonathan Routh and free speech. We don't know the right designs ahead of time. There's only the experimentation. There's only the freedom of speech. Like what we think is a good idea today, 5 years from now, turns out to be a horrible idea, right? So if you kill the learning, if you kill the speaking, then your likelihood of coming upon the time design that efficiently brings the next step is extremely low, right? So there has to be great versatility and openness on the human side to precisely be adequate in the time design so that AI can efficiently accelerate that movement forward, because you cannot skip. You cannot skip. Because of the nature of knowledge is. But let me pass it to Jurij, and then if anyone else wants to say anything, please. Jurij.
Yeah, so connecting to the questions thing and specifically to how you were describing asking for help, I'm thinking in terms of the difference between engineering education and science education, where I think engineering is kind of very trainable in the sense of you have a goal, and if you can sort of, you just put a person, okay, here's what you need to do, or the person says like, okay, I'll build this, right? And there's a finite set of things and problems to be solved and genius to flourish within these constraints, right? And you can ask for help within these constraints, and you can like, okay, how do I get there? How do I get there, right? And the goal itself is justified, and you can create many different goals for the student. The student can create goals for themselves, right? And it's like a hustle, and they don't necessarily need to like go through a fucking textbook, because as soon as they encounter an issue, they'll ask ChatGPT, they'll figure it out. And like, so engineering itself is like this very like, you know, sort of linear thing, and there's a lot of room for genius to show itself within the context of engineering or building a business or something like that. But when it comes to science and education in science, the mistake I think we've made is we've trained scientists as engineers. So by the time you're at the frontier of knowledge, you've acclimatized yourself to solving tasks, right? Like you've solved a bunch of tests. You're like grudging through all the fucking maths you need to do to become a theoretical physicist, right? Like you've completely like numbed yourself to the like original wonder and like this spirit of discovery, which is necessary for you to even to get to the frontier of like spirit of discovery. So how do you train those fields? Because like, I mean, obviously like the sort of like the tradition of, you know, for physics, right, is like very kind of broken since like the quantum revolution, and like we've simply trained engineers, right? And before that there was like, you know, whatever, 200 years of just like plain flourishing of the thing. And so we've switched from like discovery to engineering, and what really happened there, and how do we like go back to actually training scientists who discover things that are inspired with wonder, because like that's just such a rare thing today, I guess.
I think it's a brilliant point. And then if anyone wants to speak, please. I think like
But
I
even,
think
even on like a practical level, how would, like, if I were to want to teach myself physics, I don't know how I would do it. But if I want to learn myself how to build a computer, I know exactly how to do it. If I want to learn myself how to, you know, be an entrepreneur or like build a business or like develop some tech, I know exactly how to do it. It's like fairly straightforward. You just got to do the work, right? But here, like if I just do the work, I'll kill the thing like which made me want to go there in the first place. So how would I even on a practical level teach myself physics? And that's a question to you. Like I don't know.
no, I mean, it's a brilliant question. Well, again, this is where I think it is extremely important not to demonize AI or ChatGPT or the internet, because these things make it possible to learn things and critically to meet people that actually can say tutor you in physics, because there's an untold amount of elders who taught at universities who have no youth or don't know anyone, who would love to be connected with people who want to learn physics, and it would be outside of an institutional structure that is probably captured by the logic and incentives of that institution, right? Like this is where, again, belonging again, not to keep talking about that, like there's a huge on the idea of the possibility of really tapping back into eldership with the social coordination mechanism that we're using here. I know incredible amounts of older people. Let's take Cleo Kearns, one of the great literary scholars on planet Earth, who comes in on philosophy, political, and all these different things. We have access to her, and she will tell us about T.S. Eliot, and she will tell us about all of these ideas, or people like Bruce Alderman. You have connections with elders who actually can guide you in these things, who are not captured by the institution. In fact, one of the reasons they're here is because the institutions didn't like them because they actually taught something. So they were kicked out. Institutions didn't want them, and we get them. We get them outside of the incentives that kill learning, right? So there's potentials of actually restoring basically elder mentorship and different things like that, plus ChatGPT. And also what you were saying, it was brilliant what you said on the scientist engineer point. Because obviously there's the wonderful Against Method by Paul Feyerabend, who basically makes the point that science is not an effing method, and he's really upset with how we've come to see science, because he's like, when you look at Galileo, it wasn't the church who was just against him. The scientists were against Galileo. Everyone was against the great paradigm shifting scientists, and this is Feyerabend's point. There is no scientific, the consensus is against the change. The thing he's critiquing is this idea that science is a consensus following a scientific method that advances one slow step at a time. And that's how we got Galileo, because when Galileo came on the scene, he was a representative of a scientific consensus that was behind him, right? So Galileo for us becomes a kind of figurehead of science, right? Feyerabend's like, absolutely not. The scientific consensus was completely against Galileo. In fact, Galileo was wrong about a lot of stuff. In fact, he also came up with results that turned out to be right before he had the evidence of it, actually, right? This man does not follow the scientific consensus. And in fact, when you go through, you see this over and over and over again. Like, why is Einstein was able to see weird images in his head, okay? A guy falling in a glass elevator. Was it, and he was bad, he wasn't that great at math, right? You get this weird thing where some of the best scientists are not engineers at all, right? Now, not always. You do have your you do have your differences, but the idea that science and engineering are not the same is strongly tied together. If anything, it's better to think of the scientist as a tinkerer. Like one can look at a Francis Bacon, because the revolution of Bacon was the ideas that one book on the knowledge machine talks about, is Bacon was counter to Aristotle, according to this book, on the idea that instead of when you get a impasse between where you have two scientific structures and they both seem valid, then the idea is now go to metaphysical reasoning to figure out which one you're going to go from there, right? And Bacon says, no, when you have two competing scientific theories, gather as much small detail information as you possibly can, and the more facts you gather will actually, so instead of going big, you go small and gather all the data points, and that's what's going to lead you to what scientific theory you should go for, right? Well, that's more of a gathering. That's more of a experimentation. It's not necessarily an engineering, and it's also kind of obsessive compulsive, right? There's something kind of weird about that, gathering all those facts, right? So there's that, but then also critically, none of that, and this is kind of a Feyerabend point, none of that does anything unless you have the scientist as the eccentric. You basically need the eccentric. You basically need the visionary person. And here's the key point. When science is conflated with engineering in the way you've said, it serves the state. It serves power, actually. That's the problem. Like now, and that's what's happened today, of course. Science is now used as this kind of, the scientists say, the facts say, and et cetera, so forth. Well, what Feyerabend is pointing at is that if you don't see the science as actually this non-method, it doesn't have a hard method, right? It's this kind of just rugged sort of, I think this is the case, and I'm going to fight for it, dang it. And I'm going to write it up. If you don't see science as that, it ends up becoming an apparatus of power that controls you, right? And yes, it does help to be independently wealthy, because otherwise, Brent, like you said, you end up just getting your wealth from someone who has an idea of what they want to see, right? So it serves power, right? And so I think, and that's certainly what has occurred. And then you have conflicts of interest, and the scientists have to do, well, what's happened? What gets grant money, right? Oh, yeah, it's scientifically funded if it gets money. And then, of course, Jim Rudd has some lovely episodes talking about we actually don't know what the peer review system is. It isn't necessarily what we think it is. It's a much more questionable process. But no, Feyerabend absolutely is all about that. And I think he really points out that you have to have this sort of visionary work, or you get into all sorts of trouble on different things. But I really do certainly. But again, like what you see on that ability to actually kind of work with the tinkering, actually work with not necessarily engineer, to see those sort of separations, I think is extremely important. So again, for me, Jurij, on that question of where do you learn the science? Where do you learn these things? These are where the social coordination mechanism makes possible ways of connecting with all of these untapped human resources and human capital in older generations, and people who have been kicked. Well, I just think about people who've been kicked out of the institutions who have a whole lot to offer that we can connect with. Brandon, please.
Wait, so Jurij, are you actually interested in learning physics, or do you just mean it sort of hypothetically if I want to join?
I was kind of I quit my job a few days ago, basically, and I have a certain amount of funds, and I'm like, why the fuck not?
So you're independently wealthy, just like I was saying.
Well,
at least
not for
long.
long, not for long. Toying with the idea, especially because I don't have a goal to strive for, right? And there's a certain curiosity which drives me there, and so there's something to pursue in that sense.
The only thought I had, this is just a kind of thought from the outside. It's not an answer to that question, but kind of drawing on what others have said. And one thing about learning, physics or any subject in a textbook is that, the story of how the discoveries were made is taken out. You're just left with the conclusions. But I think like to really understand the spirit of science and how these discoveries are actually made, it's almost better to read really well done biographies of the people who made the discoveries. One, Bill Bryson has a book, A Short History of Nearly Everything, where he just kind of like tells a narrative of all the great scientific discoveries. It's not granular enough, I think, really to help, but that was just a thought that occurred to me. Like, it would be interesting to read like a really good biography of Newton or a really good biography of Einstein that tried to convey like everything that was happening in their intellectual world that kind of led them to ask the particular questions they asked and have the particular leaps that they had. Anyway, that's all. It's not really advice. It's just like a thought, that occurred to me.
No,
I'm not right now really interested in learning physics, but I think if I were, that's probably one thing I would want to do.
I strongly agree with that advice. I would put way more biographies in school than textbooks. Shelby Foote had that lovely idea based on he attributed it to Keats in his Civil War trilogy. He kind of makes the point that a fact is not a truth until you love it. And the idea of that is the only way you can love a fact is through literature or narrative. And he was extremely critical of the way that history was wrote because it was basically wrote either like a chronicle, just listing out facts or just linking up random, but it wasn't told as a story. And because it wasn't told as a story, it didn't become an emotional investment that could actually change you. And basically what Foote is getting at, and I would echo it in some of the work of like Hayden White, is the idea that if you want to actually learn history, you do not learn history by remembering the facts of history. You learn history by internalizing it and actually going, oh, I actually see how these people experience the world. Like I just finished the book, and I'll give it to Mr. Jockin here, Gambling with Armageddon on Sherwin's The Cuban Missile Crisis. I talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis all the time because I would force everyone to read a book on the Cuban Missile Crisis because it's freaking insane. And the problem with the Cuban Missile Crisis is that you know the result. No. We need to get you back to when you didn't know the result because that's insane. And I also think the Cuban Missile Crisis is basically the most likely kind of thing that's going to get us in trouble in the future. Like the next political black swan will be something more like the Cuban Missile Crisis than it is some sort of known, planned geopolitical occurrence. It will be something more like the Cuban Missile Crisis, in my opinion. Well, you need to read a book on the Cuban Missile Crisis to actually get into the tension of that, or you really don't internalize that. Brandon, please.
Very briefly before you, Thomas, I just parenthetically, Dan, now that you've thought or read this book and have thought a lot about the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm just curious, what do you think the probability was, the actual probability was of something, of a nuclear war occurring?
I honestly, Brandon, I think it was like more likely than not. I think it was more like 80 that we got very lucky. It was all luck. Like it really, in my opinion, was.
I mean, because I've heard other people, I actually generally don't hear 80-20, but I definitely have heard people who I respect say it seemed more likely than not, or it seemed like 50-50 or like 1 in 3. I think my dad told me that he went to bed one night thinking nuclear war was imminent.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
No, so for example, and I know you do a lot of work with Latin America, and for example, if Eisenhower didn't have preset the Bay of Pigs when Kennedy comes into office, which then humiliated Kennedy, so he's skeptical of the military generals, right? And he's skeptical of the CIA. Well, then Kennedy would have just gone along with what they were saying. And what were they saying? We need to bomb the nuclear missile. They were like, day one, we need to blow up all the missile silos or what's being constructed before it's too late. And Kennedy on day one was basically on their side. right? He was agreeing with it. But then he had the happen. Basically, the great hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis is Stevenson, Adla Stevenson, who happened as and Kennedy didn't even like this guy. Like, he actually treated him as if he kind of humiliated him after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the record shows that basically Kennedy's best decisions were inspired by Stevenson, and he never gave him credit, right? Like, so Stevenson, as an ambassador to the UN, happens to be in Washington, D.C. in a hotel, and right before Kennedy makes the order, yeah, bomb it all. And of course, the CIA dramatically underestimated how much Russian forces were there, how many nuclear missiles were already there. The CIA was completely wrong on the data. If America would have bombed, the likelihood of a nuclear attack or of course, Russia going into Berlin would have been much higher. But Stevenson basically, he said to Kennedy, no, let's try diplomacy. Like, let diplomacy first before we do this. Without that voice, without Stevenson saying that, Kennedy would have gone along with the military generals. But Stevenson said it, and Kennedy was already primed to question the military generals, so he delayed. And then Kennedy came up with the very, very weird idea of a naval blockade without a declaration of war, which everyone thought was stupid. Like, they're like, that's the dumbest thing I have ever heard. But it was actually one of the most brilliant things that ever happened. That Kennedy did that because it allowed him to thread the needle, but there was not a single military general that had that idea who wanted to go along with it, but he was able to thread that needle. And of course, you had various incidents where people almost shot nukes because there was an error in the system. And honestly, had it gone much longer, the likelihood of that kind of mistake would have been very high. You also had the ability when that U-2 bomber was shot down, that the White House didn't panic. You know, Robert Kennedy, they're like, well, that's it, we're screwed now. But you actually were able to have the threading of the needle. And then Stevenson, who is the unsung hero, gave that rousing UN, narrative to the diplomat of Russia to get the entire world on their side. Because basically the problem Kennedy also had is that if you would have blown up all the missile silos in Cuba, the rest of the world would have been like not sympathetic to you because they're all living in the range of nuclear missiles from Russia. And they're like, we have to live with this. Why don't you have to live with this, right? And so there were a lot of lucky, just straight lucky influences on Kennedy that were more likely than not to have occurred. But because they did occur, we're not dead. So I do, unfortunately, I really do give a lot of credit to Adali Stevenson. I think he was a massive factor in all of this, and the chances of him being there to be a massive factor were incredibly low. And all evidence shows on day one, Kennedy was going with the generals. He was not, like, it's framed now, and I'll stop and give it to Jochen. It's a tremendous question. The evidence the record shows that Kennedy was the great voice of reason with the military generals, and he wanted diplomacy from the start, and he had an idea of how to work with Khrushchev and different things like that. No, he was not. He had the influence of Stevenson, and then he came to that side. But, and he also did critically maintain lines of communication, not always directly, mostly, but, he didn't cut off communication with Russian diplomats when the military generals were like, yeah, we want to cut it off. This is bad. So, but that speaks to freeing speech, in my opinion. The ability of the administration to maintain communication, to humanize the Russians and vice versa, was extremely important in all of this. But that then speaks to thinking beyond technical problem solving, because technical problem solving, quote unquote, IQ, is bomb the missile bases, and Kennedy had a different approach. If I were to give I know I'm going, but it's a fact. If I were to give Kennedy credit, because he does deserve credit, I'm not saying he's irrelevant. I'm just saying I do think it was wrong of him to throw Stevenson under the bus. But Kennedy's capacity is where everyone else in the Pentagon, in the military said, what is the response to Khrushchev? Kennedy said, what is the reasoning of Khrushchev? He wanted to know, why is he doing this? Where the military just wanted to respond, Kennedy in all the tapes is like, but why is he putting the missiles here? What is his motives? Surely he knows if he does this, we're all going to die. That was the genius of Kennedy, is he was asking motivational questions that then said, well, what about the missiles in Turkey? Is it possible that he just sees this as an equal thing because we've got missiles in Turkey? And, he was able to reason and humanize Khrushchev. And that was in his personal disposition that was then, dare I say, pushed by the environment of Stevenson, brought out that latent potential that and the question that brought out a latent potential that saved the world, right? And if that is, and this is also why I think this is actually a wonderful episode to bring in. If this is also, which I think it is, then this speaks to the utter necessity of alternative education as we've been describing it. Because it is these unique capacities and these unique inner dispositions and different ways of approaching problems and not being tunnel visioned that as a non-rational variable in a game theory problem, a multipolar trap, that is the only way to get out of it. Because the Cuban Missile Crisis is a multipolar trap, basically, in game where everyone is building up. Well, when you have that, as we've talked, the only way to get out of that is to do something not irrational, but non-rational, outside the box, outside the 9-dot problem, right? If your best and brightest and your leaders do not have non-rational capacity, the probability of an episode occurring, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, that will instead be a complete disaster is far higher because you have no backup of non-rational resources in the people there to think outside the box. So you're just going to follow the Nash equilibrium and the multipolar trap and we all die. So I think this question of education for me is actually very geopolitically salient once you consider those. And then, of course, when you, well, if we don't want to be in the guns of August, right, World War I, you need that non-rationality. And also it actually is extraordinary to me when you go through history how many times it was some non-rational variable that actually made all the frickin' difference. But here's the problem. When you study history, since you study it through a mode of rationality, you interpret it all as a product of rationality, of strategy and thinking and IQ. No. That's the problem with learning history as conclusion, as you said so well, Brandon, versus literature. Literature, the genius of literature is it never loses sight of the non-rational variable. The characters are people. Therefore, they have non-rational dimensions, right? Literature keeps the rational and the non-rational braided in the experience. When you know the conclusions, it falls way too much into technical knowledge. It actually leads to the propaganda of autonomous rationality and IQ at the expense of the non-rational, which is just setting you up for a multipolar trap. It's just setting you up for game theory. Like if you take game theory seriously, and I think you see that when you experience literature as history, you see over and over and over and over again the necessity of the non-rational, and thus you better have an education system that is training that inner capacity, or next time you have a Cuban Missile Crisis, you might not be so fortunate. So I think it's a brilliant example, and I really appreciate it. And also I would say, to your point on science, when you approach science as literature and a biography, then you fall in love with science. When you just know the conclusions of it, you just know that you don't actually learn the heart of, I almost want to say heart of science, right? Like the beauty of a biography is it teaches you the heart of the scientist, the heart of the military general, the heart of the politician, the heart of the explorer. If you do not learn that, then if, let's say you enter a position of power, you actually haven't learned how to be in that position of power because it requires that heart to not end up in the multipolar trap. Like that to me, I know but the education system is setting up the leaders of our society to have no non-rational capacity. Like they don't. They're just technocrats, basically. Well, that means the logic of the civilization, almost, and you could almost think of like collective action, Marcise Olson, Rise and Decline, like this idea of the zeitgeist pulling people along. Well, yeah, because if the education system is not incubating through design non-rational capacities and everyone's just pulled along, like the freaking mouse in the Kafka hallway, right? And so we're just kind of brought along. And that's where people then are rightly, you see people voting for people like Trump or people who are thinking outside the box because they're looking for someone to break up the kind of collective action that's a kind of non-rational choice, but it's the only thing that people have in order to break through these Nash equilibria situations. But wouldn't it be nice if we could just have a school system that actually just incubated that in everyone, that actually brought about that capacity? Well, that would require economic, institutional incentives and entrenched entrance to be broken up. So it's a real problem. But history, in my opinion, is a story of the necessity of these alternative thinking, all the more so, the more complicated, interconnected, and fragile the system is. The more it becomes like that, the more utterly, utterly important the non-rational variable is. Because whereas in the past, if you didn't have it, it was more contained, it wasn't interconnected with the whole world. If you don't have it now, it's freaking interconnected. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, in my opinion, is an example of that. I'll give it to Mr. Jukic and then if anyone else. Mr. Jukic.
Nice. We wrap up with like a great diversion, a great epic story at the end. All right. So obviously, I want to say great points with everything being said. I think Yuri's original, okay, two notes. One is yes, biography, yes. I think it does matter, the biography. And I think it's I say this because, for example, I was just reading recently a Jonathan Ives biography. It's like, there's a very big difference between like that New York Times biography style versus like a Robert Caro, for example. Robert Caro is, if I think of like what is the paradigm of the kind of biography that is worth studying and reading, is his 100%. Just compare, you know why? Because you're relying on that historian's lens of framework. And if it's very, quite bluntly, a normie kind of read, you're not really getting much information really of the substance we're talking about, this kind of depth of consideration. Daniel, you're bringing up about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that specifically, like, for example, that parameter of thinking about response versus reasoning, that's huge. That's absolutely huge. By the way, like, as an example for Robert Caro and with Robert Moses, you want to study about the nature of, for example, urban planning, how power works. What's really interesting about his real mark of genius for Moses was observed by Robert Caro was the moments of pause. Long story short, there was a certain time when he was not at his ascent of power that he was forced to use the commuter train along that railroad. So he had an hour and a half every day where he had to meditate and think and consider. And Robert Caro made a hypothesis that was a very distinctive difference in terms of his mode of response of the work he was doing versus later in his career when he had ascended to power and so much time, his demand of attention was so short that he had no time to think anymore. So I think that's an example. As one little tidbit from like why Robert Caro as examples is a great biographer or historian, is because of that kind of level of investigation that he's offering for the reader. You can supplement that with primary citation. If you go read the letters, for example, reading Cezanne's letters are really important to understand the kind of why was he so important in post-impressionist thinking and as a critical launch point for Picasso and the post-impressionist abstract art movement. There's something very good quality of reading their personal letters as opposed to relying on secondary textbooks or even secondary historian, like New York Times style normie kind of readings, because they have that huge fallacy of like they're reading it through a lens of that kind of normative expectation, so that makes a big difference in understanding. But Yuri, on your original point though, I got to be honest, how to learn something. I used to mentor young professionals on this point. If they had this area of topic they really were interested in and didn't know where to start, you know what I would tell them? I would say, go read the top professionals in that field. Go read their text. Actually, go read it. Go read it and with real intent. Go read it and show where you do not understand the concepts of it. Reach out to that person. After you read that and ask for a conversation. We have these questions. Actually, the way I did it was with them. This is 10 years ago. I said, there was one individual. He was very interested in AI. This is so funny because now it's like obvious, like it's the most obvious topic. But back then, 10 years ago, it really wasn't that new. Not at all. It really was cutting edge thought. I told him, go read the top scholars on this topic. Do you know where they are? I said, yes. He went to go find out. He found that out. He said, go read their articles. Schedule interviews. Ask for an interview with this person. Do the interview. Show you actually care. You want to learn. And then actually, as a gift, publish that interview and make it public. This individual went from a college dropout in engineering to basically one of the top hilariously experts in AI. He got hired by WeWork from doing those interviews, and then he actually started his own business from that. He spun off, did his own business, and then he's independently wealthy now. And my point is, now, can I verify that with same strategy would work today? No, I can't. I can only tell you what happened in the past, which was you'd be amazed how much people don't read other people's stuff. Like, to show real intent to understand someone else, seeking to understand, and then showing a real interest to reach out. People are very sympathetic to that if you're showing you actually care and not just trying to draw value out of them. And you can create mentorship that way. I'm not kidding. It's kind of amazing, but it's true. Which is so hilarious because you would think no, I have to know these people, I have to know these really. No, you don't. You just have to you have to pay the price of reading. You got to pay of intent, reading, and trying and showing real honest signals of trying to learn. That'd be my advice. So, like, quite frankly, if you got the free time, go do the readings. Go do the readings of the topic one physicist, for example, and you would be. I would make a prediction. You'd be very surprised. The feedback you would get. I say this because I did research in dyslexia, and I reached out to the experts in dyslexia. I got emails from those individuals from a very high ratio of success with having exchange conversations 5 years ago when I was doing that work in dyslexia reading interventions. So just as an example, like, you can do it. It's not that it's like, actually, I want to be fair though. Let's be fair. Like, to have the kind of willpower, self-directedness, consideration, and thoughtfulness to do that without being told to do it. Like, that's the key. That's incredibly rare. These are part of the honest signals to show that, quite honestly, you're in the top 1% of a certain population within a certain domain, that you have these qualities. Just to show, and just to close on that note. But Daniel, your I don't know what word to call it. Your great work of discussion about the Cuban Missile Crisis was phenomenal. I think it's a great point you're making about that too. And I yield.
Well, thank you, sir. And I could not agree frickin' more with what you just said on the idea of, if you actually read the person, you would be absolutely amazed how many people are willing to speak. You say, they'd never talk to me. Oh, do not. Absolutely. And also with the social coordination mechanism, Zoom, YouTube, and all that, the ability to do what Mr. Jonkin just said is absolutely at your fingertips. Like, not just chat, like the ability to do what Mr. Jonkin just said is everyone's talking about ChatGPT being at your fingertips. And of course it is. I'd like to emphasize the social coordination that's at your fingertips. The social coordination at your fingertips is the greatest in history. We've never had anything like it. You read about, on biographies, how many people were willing to just speak to the guy who drove to their house, had read the novel, and actually knew something about it. They talked to it. It was like, I've never met someone who actually has read my novel that deeply and actually wants to care about it. And you drove here. Wow, that's a really big deal, right? So, like, people being willing to do that is a big deal. Now, because the culture has shifted and just, like, having a conversation is a big deal, like, the very fact that you are willing to do that and you've read it deeply, and then here's the other key. I do think now, because the logistical challenges are less, you do have to make up for that with conversational skill and conversational ability to interact, right? Where you actually have a certain ability to help them think with you, or you are able to give insight. This is just me making a claim that I don't know is true. I think in the past, if you went to, say, meet William Faulkner and you had read The Sound and the Fury, the very fact you drove to see him, even if you didn't necessarily have the great insight or understand everything, would mean a lot to William Faulkner, and he would want to talk to you, right? Now, if you jump on a conversation, because the logistical barrier is down, you must make up for that by competence, capacity, and insight into the work, right? Which you can't do if you don't read it. And just reading it deeply also sends a signal that even if you don't off the cuff have that insight, that you're the kind of being that's more likely to develop it than not, because you're intrinsically motivated, right? So there's a powerful signaling mechanism that is now here that cannot be overstated. And also, if you are the kind of person who would even use the social coordination to do this, you probably are already learning on your own about different things. So you probably will be quite engaging in the conversation. You probably will be someone who adds value to them. But just the very act of showing a genuine desire to understand means the world to people. And that, you just be amazed, like, a lot of people, to Joaquin's point, a lot of people like, well, I have to climb the social ladder to get a conversation with that top scientist. I have to go to Princeton and get the credentials. They'll never speak to me. No, if you actually just genuinely read the work, there are so many people with credentials that do not read. There are so many people with credentials who do not read deeply and tarry with the text. If you do that, you now have the technology to access them without driving to Princeton, and you can directly shine with that thing that is way more valuable than the credentials. Yeah, they'll talk to you because they poured their life and soul into this. And here's someone who actually frickin' cares. And that right there makes them care about you, because you care about them. So they care about you. It works like that. So I think Mr. Jockin's advice is spot on. And you cannot overstate the power of that quality of care over credentials, especially today when people don't trust institutions, when people think college is just wasting money, decentralization, all that. Today, in the collapse of quantification, which has been occurring, then the opportunity of quality is greater than ever if you take the initiative to coordinate its shine. You have to coordinate yourself to the place where you can shine with that quality, where you can engage with that quality, but you can do it. It's there. But you do have to do the work of the reading. You have to do the work of the actual understanding. And that's usually way harder than just passing the test or getting the credentials. To really, really tarry with the work and know how to talk about it. To know how to talk about something is very difficult in a manner that is that's going to grasp them. But you see, if you're genuinely intrinsically interested, then you'll do that difficulty often without even noticing it. You forget the difficulty. You find yourself working 300 hours on something and go, oh, did I work 300 hours on that? I didn't notice. Yes, because you self-forgot yourself in it. You flowed with it, right? So that quality of attention and quality of work plus social coordination, I think, is incredibly powerful and is an environment that could unlock latent potentials of who knows what. And that's, I think that's what we're looking at here. It was a beautiful comment, Mr. Jockin. And thank you all for being here. I've enjoyed it immensely. Jurij, Javier, Mr. Jockin, everyone, thank you for your time. Complete delight. All the best to you.